almost a self-defense mechanism, almost an evolutionary sort of self-defense thing that keeps you from focusing on things that could be apocalyptic, but probably won't affect you as much as something that's much smaller, but that's much more likely and more in your near future. I'm also seeing an interesting dichotomy between our ability to act intelligently as individuals versus our ability to act intelligently as groups. And let me just say, there's only been 9 million intelligent people over the history of the world that have already thought about this. So I'm coming a little late to the party. But this idea that if theoretically we had a system here, and part of this you have to understand, I've been rereading Marcus Aurelius lately, and it puts me in a dreamy, utopian kind of mood about wise leaders with total power who, but you think about our best and our brightest, what humanity can produce in any number of areas, and you say, you know what, you put these people in charge, you give them the tools, and I have a feeling we could navigate all of these dangers that everything from the modern pace of change outstripping our brick and mortar framework, everything you could think of, AI's development, nuclear weapons, all these terrible challenges, the terrible diseases in our future, global warming, everything. You put the best and the brightest in this country. I sound like it's the Kennedy administration, but you know what I mean. You put the best and the brightest, and I think we have a pretty good chance. But that's not how it works, right? Marcus Aurelius is followed by his son, who's an idiot. Right. So that system breaks down right there. Our system avoids the best and the worst case scenarios of a system like that. We don't get the idiots as easily, but we do get them. But we also don't get those people. My stepdad used to say the reason you don't get better presidents is because they're too intelligent to take the job. Our system doesn't encourage those kinds of people to get into positions of power and authority. And I would suggest that there are broad lessons that history teaches, not the kind that people ever use when they're using arguments or trying to make a political point, but certain things like leadership matters and poor leadership eventually sinks you. These are broad truisms. I had a history professor once explain the fact that the United States used to have a lot of margin for error when it came to leadership. 150 years ago, you got tons of resources. You got lots of land you haven't expanded into yet. You got lots of things to make up for stupid decisions, right? Lots of room for error. Fast forward to now, not so much room for error anymore. The price we pay for leadership that is not of a high caliber is higher. I'm not sure what a logical amount of leadership ability is to even expect. But I think we could suggest, and I don't want to single it out. People like to single it out to the last 2 years or something. This has been something you could make a case that, I would make the case that this is a mid-20th century and afterwards growing phenomenon. But it certainly is not the last president or two or three only. The imperial presidency was written in 1969, 1970, 1971, somewhere in like that. And I see a continuation of those trends reaching a point where collectively, for us to get out of this trouble, we're going to have to act on a level of intelligence that I know we possess as individuals, but I think the jury is still out on whether we possess it when we're acting as a herd. And so you had mentioned, what we had talked about with Kennedy being elected because, who did better at the debate or who's going to lower my taxes or all these banal things 2 years before potentially 100 million plus people are killed in a thermonuclear war, right? Did you elect the right guy then? If human beings die out someday, or I think Nick Bostrom described his definition of the words existential threat to mean moving backwards permanently in human capabilities. So, for example, if you could no longer put a satellite in space and you never could develop to that point again, that would be existential. I think if that ever happens to us, I think it'd be pretty easy to say we just weren't smart enough collectively. Put it on our epitaph.
Right. Well, to tie in a lot of these things together, with your book looking at how humans approach existential crises, whether they're real or whether they're imagined, I like your honesty in the book that you mentioned this is a massive question, and I do not have the definitive answer, but I'll put forward theories because a lot of historians, if they can't give a definitive answer, then they just simply don't do it. So they're always focused on these micro-targeted things that...
Let me stop you, though, because this is a salient point. I had to argue with everyone I dealt with in that book to not state a conclusion because they said it's expected, people will want it will have no focus without it. So just so you know, it may not be the fault of those people. There's a lot of pressure to state an argument and then back it up as the way these things are formed. But if that's the case, as you just alluded to, how do you do that about things that have no answers right now? Does that mean you can't talk about them until you personally come up with one? So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's actually not just a salient point. It was a huge bone of contention throughout the writing of the book.
That's very interesting. And it is something that, well, okay, if we can't have a solid answer, are we not even allowed to speculate? Then what can we do? But here's what I'm curious about. I suppose this is a bit of a value judgment on your part, but there are cases in the past where people perceived an existential crisis, or maybe not in the way you termed it, a civilization-shattering crisis that was the case. The Bronze Age collapse, somebody's society being essentially wiped out by Mongols, smallpox, whatever, take it. Then there are other cases where people's lizard brain takes over and they think, I'm in England in the 1600s and there's a Catholic on the throne. God will surely kill all of us. And maybe from their perspective, that was reasonable. But then we could look at doomsday cults and we could point at someone who truly is not acting rationally. Or as you said, the president with the better coiffed hair is what I should care about, not thermonuclear war. So are there cases in your mind where you looked at this society did a good job responding to a challenge, or they understood this threat the way that it should be understood and they didn't blow it out of proportion? And then can you think of negative examples too?
Certainly the most obvious in-your-face examples are the ones that pop up. I mean, the ideas, you look at the superstition connected to seeing conquistadores as gods coming back to, those are some of the real tragedies of history, but they're connected to these really human sides of us about tradition and prophecy. And I mean, you would talk about people always predicting sort of the end of the world. And you feel like the guy with the sandwich board, that the end of the world is near, that if he's out there long enough, eventually the broken clock will be right twice a day, right? I think when you talk about examples of handling change well versus not handling change well, I don't, because the nuclear one is the one that always comes to mind, because it's really a question that you have to grade on a curve regardless. Because I would say that, and when we did the podcast on it, we only focused on those really dangerous first 20 years, till the Cuban Missile Crisis, really. Because that was, it seemed to me, like the child playing with matches era, where whenever you get hit with these new challenges that requires an immense amount of growth on our part collectively, I feel like there's some wobbling initially. And then a sort of stasis comes into play after a while where we seem to – and of course the downside of that is then you get complacent, right? We haven't had diseases for a long time. We don't have to worry, and then boom, right? But I do feel like with the nuclear one, it's a perfect example of it depends on how you grade it. If you say we did not have a nuclear war, we did not kill 100 million plus people with nuclear weapons, we've never used a nuclear weapon in anger since, well, that's a high grade. If you say, did we manage to put aside our differences as human beings? Did we manage to act rationally, avoid the pitfalls that we normally do? Blah. Did we manage to not use these nuclear weapons like a club to browbeat? No, we didn't do any of those things. So it depends on your grading criteria. I tend to be an easy grader because you had mentioned things like the Bronze Age. To me, that's the curve I'm playing on. So if we're avoiding systems collapse and massive death and Second World War, I mean, the thing that always scares me, and that as I get older seems more and more like a truism, is that idea that sometimes if it's been too long since you've actually smelled the bodies, that we too easily forget whatever lessons we think we learned. And I think in my lifetime, I've gotten a chance to watch that happen. And it's somewhat appalling, and at the same time almost looks like a human evolutionary self-defense mechanism, like what you and I were talking about earlier. I mean, if you had to live with the trauma of the Holocaust, for example, and the Second World War, as recently on your mind as it was on people the year after the war was over, and then add to that all the things that have come after it, all the things that came before, as though they were fresh in your mind, I think we'd all have such collective PTSD we wouldn't be able to operate. But the flip side of that is, when it's been too long since you smelled the bodies, maybe you forget how dangerous some of this crap we throw out there willy-nilly and blithely at each other can be if it goes too far. And when it starts to go too far, you don't always have the ability to pull back and say, whoa, I didn't mean, let's bygones be bygones. Let's not go there. Sometimes, if you push long enough, the momentum starts pulling in the other direction after a while, leading us to places we don't want to be. And then you get to smell the bodies again, and then it's rinse, repeat all over again, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And all the more reason to teach history. So kudos to you for doing so.
There you go. I'm just plugging the genre. This was all promotion.
There you go. Exactly. Learn about the Mongols. Don't let another invasion happen to you.
That's right. Study history. And now a word from our sponsor.
Exactly. This is brought to you by MeUndies.com. Right. Nope. Sorry. I'm not doing a live host read for that.
History.
Done some weird host reads in the past, but thankfully never MeUndies. Well, I guess I'm never going to now.
There you go. But you walled off that whole area of possible income.
Never planned on it, so I guess that one's safe.
There you go.
Well, yeah, Dan, thanks a lot. I mean, people sometimes are reticent to chew off massive topics, but that's what we did here. So before we round things out, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we close up?
Well, listen, I mean, you said it yourself. Part of what allows me to occupy this particular niche that I do is the lack of expertise. I mean, we can talk about this kind of stuff in a way that truthfully, I mean, if I could be grandiose for a minute, that I feel acts as a wonderful intermediary between historians and the average public, in the same way that one of the things that I think my people, journalists, have failed the general public over time on is our science reporting, right? I don't think we've done a very good job of reporting scientific breakthroughs and controversies and all that stuff. I don't think the scientists have failed. I think that the intermediaries that help connect scientists with the general public, which of course connects them with policy in a democratic system, I think that's all been kind of a failure. I look at my role and the role of people who do what I do, which involves a lot of authors who are not historians but write books on history and all these kinds of things. I think if we do our job well, our job is to help. It's almost like I could never meditate by myself. I need help. I need somebody to stand there. And some people who are not naturally gravitated towards history just need a little help learning how to control their breathing and focusing on, what they, and all of a sudden it opens up that whole world to them. So, I mean, I think that the fact that you and I are able to talk about these massive, giant themes that no specialist historian would ever talk about now, because it falls out of every specialty and involves all kinds of rampant, irresponsible speculation. I think that's what I do. And I think people like yours truly, I hope, help energize and appetize people towards these larger historical questions, because just like you mentioned, I mean, I think now is a wonderful time to see how it really shows us something about ourselves. And if you don't think it's applicable, go look at how humans reacted to the Spanish influenza in 1919 and how humans are reacting to the coronavirus now.
Absolutely. A lot more overlap there, but much lower death toll now. Hope it stays that way. We'll see.
There's no World War I going on, thank God, at the same time.
Yeah, we have antibiotics, so a lot to be grateful for.
That too, and ventilators, exactly. Some anyway, thank God.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, this is really great. I appreciate it. And you have a lot going on. You have Hardcore History, you have your book, you have Hardcore History Addendum, and other things. If people want to find out everything you're up to, where is the best place to find you online?
I'm on Twitter, at Hardcore History, but you can also just go to the website at dancarlin.com. Usually that's how we do things. And then, of course, my massive podcast 2.5 times a year, the big one comes out. So we'll absolutely fill up your podcast feed with content on that. And we have the Hardcore History Addendum feed, too. And if I can ever get my act together and record a good one, we'll get a Common Sense out again, too. And listen, I really appreciate what people like you do. I love what the podcast history space has become. And so, congratulations and continued success.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for joining us.
Anytime. Thanks, buddy, for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right. So that is all for the episode today. Once again, I want to start things off by thanking the Spy Masters of History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our Spy Masters include Bill Ivey, Moondoggy from Ohio, Tom from Ohio, Ryan Gillen, Rob from Chicago, Nick Brooks, Michael from New York, Carl from Norway, Josh Reddick, Jennifer French Lee, Jay Carrington, the McCraes, David Santi, Chris C., and Baron Fraser. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout. Second, please leave a review and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player of choice, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. Third, join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook